I've learned that the forest doesn't raise its voice when it's trying to warn you. It whispers, soft, steady, patient, like it knows the exact moment your confidence will slip and the moment after when you'll finally listen. And if I'm being honest, I didn't listen soon enough. My name isn't important, not compared to the places I've walked or the things I've seen. I'm 43 years old, and I've spent more than half my life in the pines, working these ridgelines, these valleys, these long, quiet plains of evergreen shadow. I serve as a ranger in a stretch of forest most people outside this county don't even bother to pronounce correctly. Locals just call it the Pines. Like that one word is enough to carry every story, every disappearance, every whisper about what lives beneath the canopy. And maybe it is. My job never started as a search for anything supernatural. I grew up here. I knew the trails before I knew multiplication tables. The forest used to be a sanctuary for me, a place where the noise of the world thinned out enough for my thoughts to breathe. The locals, old hunters with sunken eyes, widows with windburned cheeks, kids raised on campfire legends, taught me early on that the trees keep score. They remember where storms split them open. They remember every fire, every footprint. They don't forget trespass either. I used to laugh at that, thinking it was just the kind of folklore that made coffee shop talk more interesting during the slow seasons. But it wasn't. The pines are older than every mistake we've made out there, older than the logging camps and the ranger stations and the roads that carve through them like scars. And if you spend enough time alone in those woods, truly alone, past the maintained trails, past the places with names, you start to understand why people used to believe the forest was alive in a way we couldn't quite map or measure. I understood it for the first time on a morning so cold the frost on my windshield looked like a frozen river delta. The kind of icy lacework you only get in deep winter, the kind that tells you the day will be quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat if you stand still long enough. I was doing routine patrol along a service road that hadn't seen a vehicle in weeks. Snow had sealed it off from tourists, and only the occasional tracks of elk or lynx crossed its length. My breath fogged in front of me as I moved, the world wrapped in that suffocating kind of silence where sound doesn't echo. It dies. Even the pines seemed to stiffen under the weight of it. That's when I saw the prints. Not animal. Not human. At least not any human who walks like the rest of us. They were spaced too far apart, first of all, long, heavy strides that sank deep into the snow. But it wasn't the size that got me. It was the shape, a 4 foot too wide. Toes splayed like something caught between human anatomy and something older, more primal. The weight distribution was off, too heavy toward the ball, like whatever made them walked with an intentional forward lean. I'd seen bear prints melted by heat, elk tracks distorted by thawing snow, even pranksters carving grotesque shapes into fresh powder. But these weren't distorted. They were clean, too clean. My first instinct was to rationalize. Snow shifts, ice expands, light creates illusions. Out here, you don't jump to conclusions, not if you want to keep your job or your sanity. But even then, some part of me, some ancient animal instinct, tightened in my chest. Because those prints didn't travel in a wandering pattern like most wildlife. They followed the road. Steady. Purposeful. As I followed, I kept expecting them to veer into the brush, but they didn't. They stayed centered on the trail, walking the same path I was, like something had used the road for its own journey through the wilderness. For a moment, I imagined something tall, cold-blooded, carrying its weight with silent efficiency, something that didn't worry about being seen because it knew it wouldn't be. And then the silence changed. It didn't break. It shifted. Sound returned in fragments, small, almost fragile noises that felt out of place. A rustle of snow, the distant tap of something hitting bark, the creak of ice. I've always believed the forest has a mood, and that morning it felt like it was holding its breath. I followed the prints until they stopped at the mouth of a clearing I'd never seen before. I've memorized every turn, every gulch, every old logging path out here, but this place, this felt wrong. The clearing was too round, too open. Snow lay untouched in a perfect circle except for the prints leading to the center. And the center is where I saw it. A shape, a disturbance, a hollow in the snow, like something enormous had knelt or crouched there for a long time. Not a bed, not a nest, a resting place of some sort. The snow had melted down to earth in that one patch, the soil exposed and dark, steaming as if heat still lingered. That's when I smelled it. Musky, sharp, metallic, like wet soil mixed with an animal's breath. It was faint but unmistakable, a scent that spoke of something that hunted without fear, something that didn't bother masking its presence. And then the sound. A single knock. A hard, resonant knock that echoed through the trees like something large striking wood with intention. 3 seconds later, another. Then silence. I froze. Every instinct told me to call for backup, but another part of me, the part that had grown up hearing stories of shapes seen in the fog, of heavy footsteps following hunters at dusk, kept me rooted in place. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Then the knock came again, closer this time, though I still saw no movement. It didn't sound like wood on wood. It sounded like knuckles, heavy ones. Something was watching me. Not stalking, watching, measuring. I stepped back slowly, breath tight, senses sharp enough to cut air. I kept my eyes on the tree line until the forest swallowed the last bit of sound and the cold returned to its unbroken stillness. When I finally turned to leave, I did something I hadn't done since I was a rookie out here. I whispered an apology to the forest. Not because I knew what I'd found, but because I knew I didn't. I reported it, of course, filed the tracks as unidentified, logged the disturbance as natural melt anomaly. Not because I wanted to lie, but because I knew the truth wouldn't help anyone. Not yet. But the locals, they had their own interpretation. When word got around that I'd seen prints that didn't match any known species, a few old-timers stopped me outside the gas station later that week. They didn't ask many questions. They just nodded as if I'd joined a silent club of people who'd seen more than they were ready to admit. One of them, a man with hands like cracked bark, said only this: "It begins with the knocking." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. In these woods, warnings never come in full sentences. They come in fragments, the same way fear does. And I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, but it was only the beginning. I spent the days after that encounter pretending everything was normal, conducting safety checks, clearing fallen limbs from the outer trails, answering visitor questions about trail conditions. But the silence in the pines had changed. Or maybe it was me who'd changed. I could feel it in the way the wind moved through the canopy, dragging a low hum through the branches like a warning muttered under its breath. Even sunlight felt different then, pale and thin, as if filtered through something unseen. I didn't talk about what I'd found in that clearing. Not to other rangers, not to the seasonal volunteers, not even to the sheriff's deputy who'd once told me he believed half the stories the old-timers swore by. I kept quiet because I knew saying the words out loud would make them real, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Besides, the pines have a way of punishing curiosity. The locals always say the forest gives you only the answers you earn, and they come with a price. The next incident came 3 weeks later, on a night when the moon was just a sliver above the treetops. I wasn't scheduled for night patrol, but a call came through dispatch about a campsite disturbance. Unusual shouting, the caller said, followed by a sound like something slamming into a tree. I could hear the caller breathing hard through the radio, but before I could get more information, the transmission cut out. I arrived to find the campsite empty. 2 tents, 2 chairs around a dying fire. A cooler open on its side, contents spilled across the frost-hardened earth. Boots still sitting by the fire pit as if someone had stepped out of them in a hurry. But no people. The tracks told a different story than the scene suggested. The footprints didn't scatter in panic. They pointed inward, toward the shadowed tree line, single file, as if the 2 campers had walked willingly toward the dark. Their steps were slow, measured, not frantic. Yet something in the way the prints sank just a little too deep at the heel made my stomach clench. They weren't walking with confidence. They were walking like people who weren't entirely in control of their legs. I followed the prints with one hand on my flashlight and the other near my holster. I've always believed in the practicality of preparedness, not because I expect trouble, but because the forest has its own rules, and not all of them bend toward reason. The tracks led 50 yards into the woods before they suddenly stopped. Just stopped. Not faded. Not scattered. The impressions ended mid-step, the last heel mark sinking sharply into the dirt, and then nothing, as if the air itself had swallowed them. I crouched, checking the ground for drag marks, animal prints, anything that might hint at where two grown adults had vanished. But the soil was pristine, undisturbed, no broken branches, no bent ferns, no sign of struggle. And then I felt it. A drop in temperature. Sudden and unnatural. My breath came out in a plume even though the night hadn't been that cold when I arrived. I stood slowly, scanning the darkness just beyond my flashlight's reach. That's when the knocking started again. Not far away this time. Not vague or distant. It came from the hollow of a tree 20 feet to my left, echoing inside the trunk before rolling outward like something massive was tapping from within. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. A rhythm that felt too deliberate to be wind or wildlife. I lifted my flashlight toward the tree, the beam shaking slightly. The bark was unbroken. No animal burrows, no visible holes, but I could feel something behind it, something that pressed its presence against the wood like a hand against a door. I could have called for backup. I should have called for backup. But there was a frozen, trance-like stillness in me that I couldn't force away. The kind of paralysis that comes not from fear, but from recognition. My mind flashed back to the old man's warning at the gas station. It begins with the knocking. Then the tree groaned, long, low, shoulders of a giant kind of groan, and the sound crawled down my spine like a cold blade. I took 1 step back, then another, could retreat further, a shape stepped between the trunks ahead of me, not fully visible, just the suggestion of height, mass, and movement. A silhouette too tall to be human, too broad at the shoulders, its outline blurring slightly in the dark, as if heat distorted it. The forest floor shivered beneath my boots. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then the silhouette inhaled, deep, wet, a dragging breath that rattled like something unused to filling lungs. And the scent hit me, earthy, metallic, a heavier version of what I'd smelled in the clearing, like rusted iron and damp fur left too long in the cold. Something primal in my body reacted before my mind did. My pulse kicked into a sprint, my muscles tensed, and I stepped back until my spine met another tree. I kept the flashlight steady, but part of me didn't want to see the thing fully, because once I did, the world would change. Permanently. The silhouette shifted, weight rolling forward as if preparing to step into the open. But just as its foot, if that's what it was, pressed into the snow, another noise cut through the night. A scream. A human one. Somewhere deeper in the forest. I jerked toward the sound, instinct overriding fear. When I looked back toward the silhouette, it was gone. No footsteps, no movement, just the same silent trees as before. The scream came again, but weaker this time, desperate. I moved fast, crashing through the underbrush with the flashlight slicing through darkness like a blade. Branches clawed my jacket, roots grabbed at my boots, but I kept going, following the echoes of that fading cry. When I burst into a narrow ravine, I saw the source, one of the missing campers. He was half submerged in snow, leaning against a fallen log, eyes wide and glassy. His hands trembled violently, fingers curled like he'd tried to hold on to something that wasn't there. His lips were blue, his breathing shallow. And when he looked up at me, the first words he managed were not the ones I expected. He kept saying, "Don't let it take me back," over and over, a mantra, a plea. I knelt beside him, trying to warm his arms, trying to ground him in something real, something safe. But his gaze darted wildly toward the tree line, following movements only he could see. I asked him where the other camper was, but he just shook his head hard enough to make his teeth clatter. When he finally found enough breath to speak more clearly, his voice cracked like old timber. It followed us from the cave. The cave, a place we didn't have documented on our maps, a place the locals avoided even talking about, a place that had been showing up more and more in the whispered stories of the pines. Before I could ask him to explain, before I could get him fully to his feet, a sharp crack echoed through the ravine, the sound of something heavy snapping a branch in half. The camper froze. His eyes flooded with a terror so absolute it silenced his breath. His body went rigid, every muscle pulled tight, and he clutched my arm with a strength that surprised me. It's here. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He didn't even blink. He just whispered those two words like a final confession. And then the forest behind us moved. Not wind, not animal. Movement with weight behind it, something stepping with deliberate purpose through the dark. I tightened my grip on the camper and reached for my radio. But I already knew help wouldn't reach us in time, not if the stories were true, not if the thing in the pines was what the locals whispered it was, not if the cave was part of all of this. And by then, I was starting to believe it was. The moment the forest shifted behind us, instinct overpowered judgment. I grabbed the camper under his arms and pulled him to his feet. He was weak, unsteady, trembling so hard his legs barely responded. But the urgency of whatever approached pushed him into motion. We staggered across the ravine, snow crunching underfoot in frantic, uneven bursts. The trees pressed close, their shadows folding over us like a second darkness. Behind us, something exhaled. A rough, guttural rush of air that didn't belong to any creature I knew. It vibrated through the ravine walls, rattling loose frost from the branches overhead. The camper whimpered under his breath, and I felt him tighten his grip on my jacket. "Keep moving," I whispered, not to reassure him, but to force my own fear into words. Fear can paralyze if you let it stay silent, but spoken aloud, even in a trembling whisper, it becomes something you can push against. We climbed out of the ravine and reached the narrow game trail I'd used to enter the forest. Every step felt painfully loud, like the woods amplified our movement to betray our location. My heartbeat slammed in my ears, syncing with the frantic crunch of our boots. The cold tightened around us, not the natural chill of winter, but a deeper cold, the kind that bites at bone instead of skin. Then came the knocking. Not from one direction this time, from many. Trees ahead, trees behind, off to the right, then the left. One knock here, two knocks there, scattered, echoing, answering each other like a chorus calling something forward. It felt orchestrated, intentional, as if the forest was signaling our position to whatever hunted us. The camper started sobbing. Not loudly, just these small, broken sounds that told me his mind was slipping toward panic. I kept pulling him forward, kept repeating, keep moving, aware that I was saying it as much for myself as for him. When we reached a fork in the trail, I stopped. The air had changed. The knocking ceased all at once, replaced by a dense, oppressive quiet. The pines have never been friendly in the dead of night, but this was different. This was the feeling of stepping inside a room where something dangerous waited in the dark. The camper tugged at my sleeve. His voice cracked as he whispered, "We shouldn't go left." It followed us when we went left. His terror wasn't hysterical, it was memory. Something lived inside those words, something he'd already encountered. And as he looked down the left path, his entire body recoiled. So I steered us right. We moved as quickly as we dared, but the forest wasn't done with us. A sudden thump echoed through the trees, like something heavy dropping from a great height. Snow shook loose from branches overhead, drifting down around us in a soft, ghostly fall. The camper flinched violently. "It's close," he gasped. I didn't tell him I knew. I didn't tell him I felt it too, that instinctive awareness crawling along my spine, a primal alarm honed by generations of humans who survived only because they recognized the moment they became prey. The trail widened as we approached a series of rock formations that marked the outer boundary of the old logging zone. The moonlight barely reached us through the canopy, but what little slipped through painted the rocks in pale silver. I aimed for that open space, knowing I needed a vantage point, a way to see what followed. And then, from somewhere behind us, a sound tore through the night. Not a roar, not a growl, something worse. A long, low, resonant moan, like breath pulled through a cavern, echoing endlessly, carrying weight and hunger and age. The camper collapsed to his knees, covering his ears, shaking violently. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering as if reacting to the sound itself. That moan didn't belong to anything natural. Something stepped onto the trail behind us, its weight making the earth tremble. I didn't look back. Not yet. Instead, I hauled the camper up and forced him toward the rocks. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but logic threaded through the panic. Don't scatter, don't trip, don't fall, keep him upright, get to open ground. We reached the first rock outcrop and I turned, raising my flashlight. The beam stopped on a shape far down the trail. Tall, upright, shoulders sloping like a boulder carved into the outline of a man. Its arms hung low, long enough that its hands nearly brushed its knees, and the eyes, if they were eyes, reflected the beam with a faint amber glow like animal eyeshine, but higher than any animal should stand. It didn't flinch, it didn't charge, it just stood there, watching, breathing. Steam curled from its mouth in thick puffs, each exhale stretching long enough to fog the air between us. Its presence filled the space like a slow-spreading pressure, the kind that makes your ribs tighten as if the forest itself is trying to push you out. The camper whimpered again, and the creature's head shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the sound. That's when I noticed something else. The knocking. It had started again, soft, rhythmic, circling us. The trees around the rocks shifted with the echo, branches trembling in a pattern, like signals passed from trunk to trunk. The creature's chest rose, then fell, then rose again, deeper this time. It wasn't knocking, it was listening to it. I grabbed a fist-sized stone from the ground, palms sweating even in the cold. My hands shook, but my voice came out steady when I said, "Don't look at it. Don't give it attention." Not because I believed it would save us, but because belief is a dangerous thing to feed in the dark. Panic grows teeth. Focus keeps them dull. The creature took one slow step forward. Its foot sank deep into the snow, so heavy the earth beneath it groaned. Not just a muffled crunch, an actual groan. Pressure, weight beyond anything I'd encountered in these woods. My breath hitched. Another step. The camper tried to scream, but it came out as a strangled gasp. I pulled him behind me and raised the stone, fully aware of how useless it was, but unwilling to stand defenseless. And then, just as the creature leaned forward, a crackling burst of static erupted from my radio. "Ranger, come in. This is base. Copy, over." The creature's head snapped toward the sound. It froze. Then, in a movement so abrupt it nearly stopped my breath, it stepped backward into the darkness. Silent, swift, vanishing so completely it seemed to dissolve into the trees. The forest held still. The knocking stopped. Only the sound of my own heartbeat filled the silence. I waited, expecting the creature to reappear, expecting its breath, its footsteps, but nothing moved, nothing breathed. Even the wind had gone still. Finally, I lowered the stone. We weren't safe, not truly, but the moment had passed. Whatever hunted us had retreated, not defeated, but simply withdrawn, as if the radio signal had disrupted something unspoken between us and the pines. I lifted the camper onto my shoulder and began the long trek back toward the logging road. Each step felt heavier than the last. My body shook with adrenaline and cold, but the weight on my shoulders wasn't just the man I carried. It was the shift that had taken root inside me. The forest had changed its rules, and I had stepped directly into its new game. The camper whispered something against my collar, words broken by exhaustion, fear, and breathless trembling. "It watched us from the cave," he murmured. "It watches everyone who gets too close." I wanted to tell him he was delirious. I wanted to dismiss it as shock, but the way he said it, quiet, hollow, certain, dug beneath my skin, because I already knew the truth. The cave wasn't just part of his story. It was part of mine now. I didn't sleep the night after I carried the camper out of the forest. I sat in the ranger station with the overhead lights buzzing every few minutes and the cheap coffee burning a bitter line down my throat. The paramedics took the camper straight to the small regional hospital. They couldn't explain the bone-deep cold clinging to him, the tremors that wouldn't stop, the way he kept whispering the same fragmented phrases under his breath. It watched us. Don't go back. Don't let it call you. I tried not to think about the cave he mentioned, but the mind has a cruel way of replaying the last thing you don't want to remember. Every time I blinked, I saw that silhouette again. Shoulders too wide, breath too heavy, eyes burning faintly in the dark like a creature made of the forest's oldest fear. By dawn, exhaustion weighed down my body, but my mind was sharpened by dread. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to fit logic over it like a sheet stretched too thin. But logic kept tearing, piece by piece. Later that morning, a deputy came by the station, his face pinched with worry. He told me the second camper still hadn't been found. The search teams picked up scattered signs, a torn corner of fabric, a glove lying near a creek bank, but no tracks, no blood, no direction. People don't vanish in clean lines out here. Even the most skilled hikers leave signs when panic hits them. But these woods weren't behaving the way woods should. The deputy left after a while, but before he walked out, he said something that stuck with me. You know the stories. Don't chase shadows you're not ready to face. He said it like a warning he'd been sitting on for years. The cave kept gnawing at my mind long after he left, the way the camper whispered it, the way his fear wrapped around the word as if the cave itself had teeth. I'd heard stories growing up, hushed tales of a hollow where sound didn't echo and fire wouldn't burn right. Old men spoke of it with superstition, like a place that belonged to an older world, one that hadn't agreed to the rules we lived by. The pines are full of folklore, but folklore doesn't make footprints in the snow. It doesn't stalk you through the dark. It doesn't listen to knocking. I tried to focus on paperwork, but every shadow in the room felt a little too patient, a little too still. The ranger station sits near the tree line, and through the windows I could see the morning fog weaving between the pines like pale fingers searching for something they'd lost. By early afternoon, I'd made my decision. I had to find that cave. Not because it was smart, not because it was my job, but because something inside me, some quiet instinct I'd ignored for too long, told me that the forest wasn't going to let me walk away from this. Not after what I'd seen. Not after what followed the campers. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. If I had, they would have stopped me. They would have pulled my badge for the day and told me to get rest. And a part of me wanted that, wanted someone to put a hand on my shoulder and say, "Don't go, you've done enough." But no one did. So I packed my gear, grabbed my radio, and stepped into the pines as the last bit of daylight began to dim. The forest greeted me with that same cold quiet, the same low tension humming through its branches. The air seemed to tighten around me the deeper I walked, like the pines had sensed my intention and were rearranging themselves accordingly. I followed the path from the ravine, piecing together what the camper had whispered. When he spoke about the cave, he'd mentioned going left. They'd gone left, and something had followed them, so I went left. The trail narrowed to a thread, then thinned into undergrowth. Branches scraped my jacket with a sound like fingernails against coarse fabric. Every snap of twigs under my boots made me flinch. The sun sank behind the treetops, and winter dusk settled fast, turning the world into a dim wash of blue and black. I turned on my flashlight, but even its beam seemed to struggle, swallowed by the darkness between the trunks. For a while I walked in silence, but then the forest began to answer me, a faint knock behind me, then another ahead. I stopped moving. My breath caught in my throat. The knocks didn't sound threatening. They sounded like signals, orientation markers, as if the forest were guiding something through the dark, something that already knew where I was. I kept walking, forcing myself not to turn around each time the knock sounded. I knew better now. The thing in the pines didn't hunt with stealth. It hunted with inevitability. It wanted you afraid enough to freeze, aware enough to know what followed, but too desperate to understand why. As I reached a steep incline, I noticed something else. Smell. That same musky, metallic scent I'd encountered at the clearing, stronger now. Not a hint, not an echo, a presence. The incline leveled off, and the trees opened slightly, revealing a narrow gorge. A small stream cut through the center, frozen along its edges, and there, tucked into the far rock wall like a wound, was the entrance. The cave. It was smaller than I expected. No grand archway, no gaping maw, just a dark, uninviting slit in the stone, framed by moss that looked too alive for winter. The air around it hummed with a cold that didn't feel natural, a cold that carried weight, like stepping too close to something that didn't want to be disturbed. I moved closer but stopped before crossing the threshold. My flashlight's beam vanished into the darkness, like the cave swallowed it whole. No reflection, no depth, just a complete absorption of light. Inside, I heard something breathing. Slow, wet, measured. I felt the fear rise in me, not fast, not sharp, but deep, heavy, a pressure behind my ribs that told me the forest hadn't been warning me, it had been preparing me. Every instinct screamed to leave. The pines behind me waited in silent tension as if the trees themselves held their breath. I could feel the boundary between outside and inside pressing against my skin like an icy hand. But I stepped forward anyway. My foot crossed the threshold. The cold hit me like a wall, stripping the warmth from my breath. The air smelled of damp stone and something older, something like the decay of creatures never meant to feel sunlight. My flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering like a candle in the wind, and then the knocking began again. Not from outside, from within the cave. Soft, echoing down the passage. And in that instant, I understood something the locals had been trying to say all along. The knocking wasn't a warning. It was a summons. My breath hitched as the knocking shifted. One knock, then two, then three, like a code tapping along the stone. Behind me, the trees groaned with the weight of something shifting. Ahead of me, the darkness breathed again. And in that cold, suffocating space, the truth pressed tight against my chest. This cave wasn't just part of the story. This cave was the source, and I had already gone too far to turn back. The deeper I stepped into the cave, the more the air tightened around me. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, the kind of cold that feels alive, creeping under your skin like it's searching for a place to hide. The sound of my footsteps barely existed. The cave floor swallowed each one like it didn't want me to hear myself leave. My flashlight flickered again, its beam thinning into a weak cone swallowed by the dark. I tapped it once with my thumb, but the brief flare of brightness only illuminated the walls for a second. Stone slick with moisture, narrow grooves etched unnaturally deep as if scraped by something with purpose. The knocking sounded again, this time from deeper within. I forced myself forward, each step measured, quiet, controlled. The cave sloped downward, pulling me into a throat of stone that felt too tight, too deliberate. My breath echoed against the walls, but even those echoes came back softer, as if the cave was listening instead of answering. And then I smelled it, that musky, metallic scent, stronger than before, thick enough that I tasted it. Iron, damp earth, fur, old things left to rot in dark corners of the world. The flashlight's beam wavered with my trembling hand. A part of me wondered if the camper had stood here too, if he'd been pulled inside by the same quiet, inevitable dread. His words whispered through my memory like echoes chasing me down the passage. It watches everyone who gets too close. The beam flickered again, and for a heartbeat, the darkness in front of me breathed out. A sound like a slow, heavy exhale filled the passage. Warm air brushed my face. I froze, every muscle locking as that breath seemed to slide over my skin like the touch of something enormous just beyond sight. I raised the flashlight. The beam illuminated nothing. Just stone, just black, just silence. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat a pulse of warmth in the icy void. I forced myself to breathe slowly, steady, like I'd been trained, but the air felt wrong inside my lungs, like breathing underwater. The knocking echoed again, this time from behind me. 2 knocks. Close. I spun, raising the beam toward the cave entrance, but the light hit only empty air. No silhouette, no shape, just the mouth of the tunnel behind me, shrinking into a small patch of faint, distant gray. For a moment, I wanted to run, just turn around and sprint until sunlight touched my face. But some instinct deeper than fear kept me still. A sense that if I turned my back on whatever moved behind the darkness, it would follow. It would reach me. It would not let me leave. The knocking came again. 1 knock. A pause. Then another from the opposite wall. A signal. A pattern. A guidance. Like the forest had taught something old how to speak through sound. I pressed deeper into the cave. The tunnel began to widen, the ceiling rising overhead until the space felt more like a chamber than a passage. The air warmed suddenly, thickening with humidity. My flashlight fought against the gloom, finally revealing something ahead, a wall carved into strange, spiraling shapes. At first, I thought they were natural formations, but the closer I stepped, the more deliberate they looked. Curves etched into stone with a precision no erosion could mimic. Spirals tightening toward a center point, each one punctuated by deep grooves. Marks, claw marks. My stomach clenched. These weren't just markings, they were warnings, and I'd ignored every single one. A low sound rumbled through the chamber, deep, vibrating stone itself. I raised the flashlight toward the far side of the room. Then the knocking erupted all around me. The walls echoed with rapid strikes from every direction, loud, sharp, urgent. My chest tightened as the cadence shifted into something unmistakable. A countdown. 3, 2, 1. Silence. Then everything happened at once. A massive shadow pulled itself from the darkest corner of the cavern, unfolding upward like a nightmare rising from sleep. My flashlight barely caught the outline, just the suggestion of height, the terrible width of its shoulders, the long sweep of its arms. Amber eyes glowed in the dark, not flickering, not reflecting, glowing, alive. The breath punched out of my chest. My legs wanted to collapse, but I didn't move, couldn't move. I was trapped between terror and a strange, paralyzing awe. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a myth. This was something that had lived here long before people gave names to the wild. The creature stepped forward, its foot pressing into the mud with a weight that made the ground tremble. Its breath rolled over me again, hot, heavy, thick with a scent that carried age and hunger. It studied me, not as prey, not as threat, like a question. My flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness slammed around me, thick and suffocating. I felt more than heard the creature shift, the air pressure changing as it leaned closer. A low rumble vibrated through the cave floor, up my legs, into my ribs. Then something touched my shoulder. Not a claw, not a grab, a tap, a single deliberate knock. The chilling realization hit me so fast my breath caught in my throat. The knocking wasn't in the trees. It wasn't around the forest. It wasn't coming from the cave walls. It was how they communicated. And one of them was touching me now. Another tap, this one lower, near my arm, as if the creature were studying me, mapping my shape the way a blind person might map a face. When the third tap landed, my body reacted before my mind caught up. I shoved myself backward, scrambling on the slick stone. My boots slid, my back slammed into the wall, and the creature released a sound so massive it rattled dust from the ceiling. Not anger. Not rage. More like surprise. I fumbled with the flashlight, slamming my thumb against the switch until the beam sputtered to life. The creature recoiled from the light, amber eyes narrowing. Its body shifted, not in fear but in irritation, as if the brightness disturbed something sacred. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking, breath ragged. The creature watched me rise. It didn't approach again. Instead, it turned, massive muscles rolling beneath hair thick enough to blend into the rock shadows, and stepped backward, retreating deeper into the cavern. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, ancient in its confidence. When it reached the far wall, it stopped. Its eyes held mine for one long, heavy heartbeat. Then it lifted its massive hand and knocked once on the stone behind it. A command, a dismissal, a warning. I don't know which. The air shifted with the force of the sound, dust drifting down like ash. I didn't wait for it to knock again. My pulse crashed through my skull, and I bolted for the tunnel, the beam of the flashlight jerking wildly as I ran. Behind me, the cave groaned, a deep, resonant sound that shook the stone walls. The knocking started again, echoing down the passage, urging me out, pushing me back toward the world above. The forest greeted me with cold air and moonlight. My legs carried me farther than I intended, not stopping until I reached the stream at the gorge. I leaned over, hands on my knees, gasping as the adrenaline finally broke free of my ribs. The pines were silent, too silent, like they knew what had happened inside that cave, like they were waiting for the next chapter. I swallowed hard as the weight of realization washed over me. I hadn't just seen it, it had seen me, and whatever intelligence lived in those amber eyes, it knew I'd return. I should have called the deputy, the search team, anyone with a louder voice and more authority than mine. But as I stood beside the cold stream staring into the dark maze of pines, a truth heavier than fear settled into me. I wasn't done with the cave. And the cave wasn't done with me. I knew it in the way the trees seemed to shift around me, branches leaning, shadows stirring, the night breathing with a slow anticipation. The pines had always been alive in their own way, but now they felt aware, watching, waiting. My flashlight hung limply in my hand, the beam trembling with the leftover adrenaline. I forced myself to stand upright, to breathe deeply, to feel my heartbeat return to something resembling a rhythm. But my mind wouldn't settle. Every thought frayed into another, loops of fear, fascination, dread, and something deeper. Curiosity, that was the part that scared me most. I'd seen this thing, this creature, this myth bone wrapped in muscle and shadow. I'd stepped into its home. I'd been touched by it. And instead of running until I reached the farthest end of the highway, part of me wanted to understand it. Needed to. Maybe that's how people disappear, not from panic, but from an irresistible pull towards something their instincts can't categorize. I turned away from the gorge and started the long walk back toward the ranger station. Every few steps, I felt the echo of that knock on my shoulder, the creature's touch ghosting through my nerves. My body remembered the exact weight of it, the intent behind it. Not violence, not aggression. Recognition. By the time I reached the outer trail, dawn had begun to thin the darkness. A pale blue washed through the trees, weak but determined, the ghost of a sunrise trying to break through the grip of winter. I stepped out into that fragile light like a man surfacing from deep water, lungs burning, heart bruised. At the station, my reflection in the window startled me. My skin looked paler, eyes darker, as if the cave had scraped something out of me and replaced it with shadows. I didn't step inside right away. Instead, I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked back at the pines. Something shifted in the tree line. Not a full silhouette, just a movement, a slow, deliberate sway, like something tall brushing past a trunk, its weight sinking into the earth. Watching. I felt that cold pressure again, the one I'd felt in the cave. But this time it didn't push me back. It pulled. I stayed outside until the sun found enough strength to paint the snow in gold. Only then did the forest loosen its hold, the presence fading back into whatever corner it came from. But the sense of being observed stayed with me, clinging to the edges of my awareness. Inside the station, my radio crackled to life. Search teams calling in updates. The missing camper still unfound. The one who'd survived still incoherent, slipping between muttered warnings and hollow silence. A nurse told me he kept repeating the same line whenever he woke from his fitful sleep. The ranger will hear it too. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. The next 3 days blurred together. Search expeditions, equipment checks, endless paperwork. But the forest wouldn't let me rest. Every time I stepped outside, the knocking followed. Sometimes distant, sometimes close. Always rhythmic, always deliberate. At night, I heard it in my dreams, sometimes at the door, sometimes on the walls, sometimes tapping inside my mind like a code I hadn't learned yet. On the morning of the 4th day, everything changed. I was heading toward the trailhead when the deputy's SUV fishtailed into the lot. He stepped out, eyes wide and jaw tight. No words, just a gesture. Follow. We drove in tense silence toward a section of the forest no one visited anymore, a place bypassed by newer trails and avoided by old maps. When we arrived, I saw the reason for his panic. The second camper had been found. Not alive, not intact. His body sat propped against a fallen tree, positioned unnaturally as if placed there with care. His face was empty. Not peaceful, empty. Like something had taken the emotion from his features. His hands rested on his knees, palms upward, and carved into the tree behind him were those spirals, the same shapes from the cave walls. The deputy looked at me, searching my face for answers I didn't have, or answers he suspected I did. But my voice felt locked behind the weight of what I'd seen, what I knew, what the pines were whispering. As the recovery team settled into somber motion, I stepped back from the clearing. The air felt heavier here, compressed. The spirals carved into the bark pulsed in my vision, like my heartbeat had synced with their rhythm. A knock sounded behind me, soft, impossible, near my ear. I spun around, hand hovering near my holster, breath frozen in my lungs. Nothing, just trees, just wind, just silence. But something inside me cracked then, not fear, but clarity. The creature in the cave. The creature in the forest, the one the old-timers had whispered about for years. It wasn't hunting for food, it was communicating, studying, responding. And the knocking wasn't a threat, it was language. A language older than the pines themselves. I knew then what I had to do. That night, after everyone left and the forest folded back into its usual hush, I returned to the trail alone. No backup, no radio chatter. Just the weight of the cold and the memory of amber eyes. The knocking started the moment I crossed into the deep pines. One knock on a distant trunk, two from the hollow near the creek, another from the ridge above, guiding me, calling me. I followed the sound through the maze of trees until I reached the gorge again. The moon hung low, a thin white blade slicing the sky. Steam drifted from the cave entrance in slow pulsing waves. My breath shook as I stepped forward, and for the first time I knocked back. One knock, a pause, two knocks. Silence swallowed the forest. Then, from within the cave, the creature answered. One deep knock, so resonant it rippled through the ground. Then another, then a third. Not a countdown this time, a conversation. The air thickened with meaning, with presence, with something ancient pulling itself toward the entrance. The ground trembled as the creature stepped into the pale moonlight, its massive shape emerging just enough to tower at the threshold. Its eyes burned with that same amber glow. It did not approach. It waited, for me, for my choice, for the truth I had refused to face until now. Because this forest, these pines, they weren't mine to protect. They were asking me to listen. The creature lifted its arm, slow and deliberate, and tapped its knuckles against the stone beside it. The sound reverberated through me. A greeting, a warning, an invitation. Maybe all three. My throat tightened as I stepped closer, closer than I ever should have dared. I stood at the edge of the cave, breath trembling, heart raw. The pines rustled in the wind, whispering around me like 1,000 unseen voices. I placed my palm on the cold stone where it had knocked. The creature's breath warmed the air between us. And in that charged, impossible moment, I understood the truth that would change the rest of my life. The forest wasn't haunted. It was inhabited. And the things that lived within it weren't monsters. They were guardians, ancient, silent, watching every time we trespassed too deeply. Every disappearance, every whisper, every knock. It wasn't malice. It was warning. I stepped back into the moonlight, eyes stinging with the weight of what I'd witnessed. The creature eased into the shadows, deeper into its world, leaving the echo of its knock trailing behind like a final message. As it vanished, the pines sighed, branches swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. And for the first time in my career, I didn't feel like a protector. I felt like a student, a witness, a keeper of the truth no one would ever believe. The forest had spoken, and it would whisper its warnings long after I was gone. I've learned that the forest doesn't care whether you believe in spirits or not. It only cares whether you're listening. And the night I finally understood that still lives under my skin like a second heartbeat, reminding me that the pines don't just hold wind, sometimes they hold memory. My name isn't important, not out here, not in a place where names get lost in the tree line. What matters is that I've spent more than 20 years walking the boundaries of a national forest most people only know from postcards and camp brochures. I'm in my early 40s now, old enough to have seen patterns, young enough to still pretend I'm not afraid of the dark. Fear belongs to hikers who underestimate the woods, not to rangers who live inside them. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. This forest, tucked deep in the mountains between nowhere and nothing, has a way of deciding who gets to be here. Locals say it chooses. They say it remembers. The old families who've lived in the nearby valley for generations whisper stories the way people whisper confessions, quietly and only after checking over their shoulders. I grew up hearing their warnings even before I ever put on the uniform. Don't whistle after sunset. Don't turn your back on a hollow that suddenly goes quiet. Don't answer if you hear your own name coming from the trees. I used to laugh at them. Every ranger does. We train with maps and radios and protocols, not folklore. But when you spend as long in the woods as I have, you start collecting moments that don't fit any official incident report. Moments that change the way you breathe. Moments that make you stop laughing. My station sits 40 minutes from the closest paved road, a modest cabin outfitted with just enough electricity to keep the lights alive. I spend more nights here than I do at home. There's a rhythm to the wilderness at night, a rhythm you come to rely on. Crickets, the distant rush of the river against stone, a scattered owl call, wind ticking pine needles like fingertips brushing a wooden door. If something interrupts that rhythm, even subtly, even for a moment, you feel it. That's not paranoia. That's survival. And it was during one of those rare still nights. Too still, so unnaturally quiet it felt like the forest was holding its breath, that I first felt the unease that would guide the rest of my life as a ranger. I was 30 when the first story began, still carrying the kind of confidence that makes you blind to the things locals think you should fear. A missing hiker had been reported, an experienced man in his late 50s who'd been visiting the area for years. His truck was found at a trailhead just north of the old quarry route. No signs of struggle, no strange footprints. He'd simply walked into the woods and never walked back out. That happens more often than people think. They twist an ankle, lose direction, get dehydrated. But something about his disappearance felt different from the start, though I couldn't explain why. His truck door was left open, as if he'd stepped out and meant to return within seconds. His pack was still in the cab. Even his thermos sat untouched in the cup holder. It looked less like he'd gone hiking and more like he'd been drawn into the trees before he finished thinking. Protocol demanded we start the search immediately. I volunteered to go alone up the quarry route, while the rest of the team divided the surrounding trails. The path winds through some of the oldest pines in the region, towering skeletal silhouettes that seem to shift if you look at them too long. The ground is soft there, damp even in summer, and walking through it feels like disturbing something that's been asleep for too many years. I told myself the tightness in my chest was just the elevation, but even then, deep down, I knew better. About a mile in, I caught the first sound. It wasn't a branch snapping or the distant call of an animal. It was a single rhythmic knock. Soft, barely there, like knuckles brushing a hollowed log. Tap, 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 tap. I stopped walking. At first, I thought it might have been a woodpecker, but it was too slow, too deliberate. Woodpeckers drill with frantic intensity, a blur of sound. This was patient, waiting, listening. I tried calling out the hiker's name, listening for an answer. Nothing. Just the knock. 3 taps, a pause, then another 3. I've never liked mimic sounds, the ones that feel too structured to be natural. My radio crackled softly, though no one was speaking. Static rising like breath in the cold. I forced myself to continue. Search and rescue demands forward motion. even when your instincts scream at you to turn back. The knocks followed me for another quarter mile, always the same distance away, as if they were matching my pace. That's when the first doubt crawled into my mind, not about my safety, but about my sanity. The forest is full of echoes and strange acoustics. It bends sound like heat bends light. I told myself that over and over until the repetition of it became a chant. You're hearing things bounce, you're hearing things bounce, you're fine. Then the smell hit, sharp, cold, metallic, like snow mixed with blood. But there was no snow, and there certainly was no blood. I swept my flashlight across the undergrowth, its narrow beam slicing through the trees. Nothing. No tracks. No movement. Not even insects. That silence again. Too heavy. Too aware. I hated how aware it felt, as though the forest itself was noticing me. The path eventually opened into a small clearing surrounded by fractured stones from the remnants of the old quarry. This is where the unease turned into something heavier. I found footprints, deep ones, leading toward the largest rock outcropping. They were human, but wrong. Longer strides than a man in his 50s should take, toes digging deeper than heels. Like someone, or something, had been moving on the balls of their feet, leaning forward as if running uphill. My pulse hammered. I crouched, tracing the edge of the print with my gloved hand. It was fresh, maybe an hour old, close, too close, and that smell intensified, metal and cold soil. I waited, listening, every muscle braced. No wind, no knocks now, just the faint trickle of water somewhere beneath the rock. A hidden stream, maybe. The prints led directly to the outcropping but didn't continue around it. They just ended at the stone, like the person stepped into the rock itself and vanished. I'd like to say I handled it well, that I kept my emotions in check, that years of training held me steady. But the truth is, in that moment, doubt wrapped around my spine like ice. Every story the locals whispered as warnings returned all at once. People walking into the forest and being swallowed by it, shapes that lived between the trees, sounds that followed you but never came from anything alive. I'd heard older rangers mention the quarry path with a kind of reverence, calling it a place where the forest thinned, but not in the way you'd expect. Not thinner in trees. Thinner in something else. As if the line between what belongs here and what doesn't becomes fragile along those stones. I stepped closer to the rock, my fingers brushing the cool surface. That's when something shifted beneath me. A faint vibration, almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat trapped deep underground. And then I heard it, my name, whispered from behind me, close enough that I felt the warm brush of breath against my ear. I spun so fast I almost lost my footing on the loose stone, my flashlight slicing through the dark like a blade. Nothing stood behind me. Nothing moved. Not a single branch shifted, but I felt it, that residual heat of breath against my skin fading too quickly to be imagined. My radio crackled again, louder this time, like someone brushing their thumb across the speaker. I held my breath and waited for a voice, a sign, any signal that another ranger was nearby. Silence. Then a faint hiss, like someone exhaling inside the channel. I've heard my name carried through canyons before. Echoes have strange behavior depending on temperature and terrain. But this wasn't stretched or warped. It didn't bounce off anything. It came from inches behind my right shoulder, where nothing but dead pine needles and cold air waited. The forest felt like it had shifted between one heartbeat and the next, pressing in closer, listening harder. I told myself to stay rational. Fear makes you hear things, internal things, bone-deep things. My instincts urged me to turn back toward the trail, but duty drove me forward. The missing hiker could be alive, confused, injured. People in survival mode do strange things. They wander into places they never meant to go. They follow sounds they can't explain. They make choices that make no sense. That's what I repeated to myself as I moved toward the outcropping again, examining the rock wall where the prints ended. The stone was cool, but not cold like it should have been in the shade. It felt warm, faintly, gently warm, like something beneath it radiated a heartbeat of its own. I pressed my palm against it and felt a pulse, steady, slow. A trick of blood in my hand? Maybe. I don't know. I want to believe that. I really do. But as I leaned in, I caught a faint sound emanating from somewhere beneath the stone. Not water, not wind pushing through cracks, a low rhythmic thrum, like something breathing through the earth. I backed away, not because of the sound itself, but because my body reacted before my mind did. An instinct as old as the forest. Something was wrong here. This wasn't an ordinary missing person case. This wasn't something I had been trained to manage with a flashlight and a map. My radio burst with static again, sharp, aggressive, like someone shouting with no voice in the channel. I jumped. Then, between the static bursts, I heard something else. Not words, not language. A rasping growl, low and guttural, unlike any animal native to these mountains. It didn't sound close. It sounded deep, like it was coming from below me, vibrating through the rock itself. I stepped back from the outcropping, scanning the shadows between the trees. Every instinct screamed at me to mark the location and call for backup. I reached for my radio, thumb poised to switch channels, when the forest finally broke its stillness. A rock rolled behind me, not a falling pine cone, not settling soil. A deliberate shift, the weight of something moving across the quarry stones. I snapped around, flashlight beam steadying on the ground. No tracks appeared, just the fresh scatter of gravel still trembling slightly as if something enormous had passed through but left no mark. That's when I realized the night, not the sun setting, but the night inside the forest, had shifted. The light dimmed unnaturally fast, shadows stretched too quickly as if pulled by unseen hands. My breath turned visible in the air, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. An old nightmare of every ranger settled into my limbs. The feeling that something was stalking you, something that didn't rely on footsteps or sound to close the distance. I retreated slowly, keeping the outcropping in sight. My pulse pounded so violently that I could hear it in my ears. The smell intensified again, that metallic bite mixed with something else this time. Something animal. Something musky. Something warm. Mountain lions sometimes prowl this area. Bears too, but the smell wasn't right for either. It was too concentrated, too focused, and beneath it was a deeper scent, a cold mineral void, like air rushing out of a deep cave. Cave. The word dug itself into my mind. That's what the locals talked about, the cave the forest tried to hide, the place where people disappeared without leaving tracks, the place no map showed anymore. Not because it wasn't real, but because no one wanted it found. I didn't want to find it either. But something in that outcropping, some hollow core beneath it, felt like a doorway. Not to a cavern, but to something older. Something that watched. I took another step back, my foot snapped a twig. The moment it broke, the forest responded. A groan rumbled from the stones. Slow, heavy, like a massive creature shifting in its sleep. The ground beneath my boots vibrated. My flashlight flickered. The trees around the clearing seemed to lean inward. And then came the second voice. Not a whisper, not breath. A deep, resonant call. An inhuman sound that reverberated through the clearing, shaking the air itself. It wasn't a roar, though it held the force of one. It wasn't a growl, though it carried the weight of something predatory. It sounded like stone grinding against stone, like a throat made from granite, like something waking up. I staggered backward, raising the flashlight instinctively. The beam jittered across the trees. Still no movement, still no shape. The forest wasn't showing itself. It was warning me. Run. The instinct slammed into me so hard I almost dropped my light. I tried to ignore it. Fear distorts logic, but the next sound shattered any illusion of safety. Another knock. But this time it wasn't soft. It was loud, violent, and powerful enough to echo through the clearing like a drum. It came from the outcropping, from the rock itself. One strike. Then another. Then three in rapid succession, as if something inside the stone was pounding to get out. Panic hit me like a wave. For the first time in my career, I felt true, bone-deep terror, the kind that bypasses thought and burrows straight into instinct. I turned and started moving fast, but not running. Running triggers pursuit. Every ranger knows that. I kept my breathing steady, my steps careful, even as the pounding continued behind me. Halfway down the trail, my radio finally crackled to life with a voice, one of the search team members asking for my location. Relief hit me so sharply I almost collapsed. I raised the radio, ready to respond, when the voice cut out. Not into static, into something else. Breathing. Not mine. Not human. Deep, heavy inhalations, dragging through the speaker like someone learning how to breathe through a too small throat. Then a sound like nails scraping metal. I dropped the radio, not purposely, reflexively. It clattered onto the packed soil, the breathing still hissing through it. I backed away until the voice dissolved into static again. I didn't go back for it. The forest seemed to clear its throat as I reached the edge of the quarry path. The air warmed, the smell faded. The ordinary chorus of the woods, crickets, distant river, the rustle of needles returned as if nothing had ever happened, as if the clearing were a different world entirely, sealed off once you crossed that boundary. But I couldn't unhear what I heard. I couldn't unfeel the breath against my ear, and I couldn't unsee the footprints that ended at the stone. When I finally made it back to the station hours later, my supervisor asked why my hands were shaking. I told him I slipped on wet stone. He didn't question it. Sometimes the truth isn't something you can say without inviting it back. I never found the missing hiker. No one did. But that wasn't the last time I heard knocking in the woods. It was just the first time I realized it wasn't always coming from outside the trees. I tried convincing myself that what happened on the quarry path was an anomaly, some mix of exhaustion, stress, and the kind of overactive imagination rangers joke about, but secretly fear. For weeks after, I patrolled only during daylight, telling myself it was because of scheduling changes, not because the forest felt different at night. The truth was simpler. I didn't trust the woods the way I used to. Something had acknowledged me out there. Something that knew my name long before I ever whispered it into the trees. But rangers don't get the luxury of choosing when fear fits into their schedule. Eventually, the forest demands your full attention, and you answer whether you want to or not. The next story began in late autumn, a time when the sun dies early and the temperature drops fast enough to make the air feel brittle. I'd been assigned to a southwestern section of the forest near a cluster of old cabins used decades ago by Firewatch volunteers. They'd long since been abandoned, replaced by better towers, better radios. But the cabins still stood, their weathered boards creaking like joints in old bone. I always hated that region. Something about it felt too heavy, like the air there didn't circulate the way it should. Locals had a name for the place, though they rarely said it aloud. Whispers Bend. Stories claimed the wind carried voices there. Conversations between spirits of the woods, warnings, even predictions. I'd never believed any of that. It sounded like campfire folklore, nothing more. But the night I was sent there alone, I began to understand why no one liked speaking the name. A call came in around dusk about a series of strange sightings near the old cabins, lights flickering between the trees, movement that didn't match known wildlife. Hunters reported hearing growls they couldn't identify. One claimed he saw a tall shape walking on two legs, covered in hair the color of moss. The man shook as he told us, trying to laugh it off, but unable to disguise the tremor in his voice. I'd heard enough tall tales of mountain giants and forest men to dismiss most of them, but this man wasn't trying to impress anyone. His eyes were too clear, too terrified. So I was sent to check the area. Alone. Standard procedure. We were short-staffed. I didn't argue. I reached Whispers Bend shortly before full dark. The final stretch of trail curved through an unnaturally quiet corridor of pines that seemed to crowd closer as I walked. My boots crunched through frost-coated needles. My breath came out in clouds. Even the birds had gone silent. The cabins appeared through the trees like hunched silhouettes, their roofs sagging under decades of snowmelt. I swept my flashlight across their warped frames. Nothing unusual, just the expected decay of forgotten wood. Then came the smell. Rot. But not animal rot, not the typical sour scent of a deer carcass hidden beneath brush. This was different, older, deeper, like soil disturbed after too many years of being left alone. And beneath it, subtly woven through the cold air, was another smell, pine resin, and something musky, damp, wild. I forced myself forward. The nearest cabin's door hung open, one hinge rusted, the other broken entirely. My footsteps echoed inside as I entered, flashlight beams slicing through dust motes. Graffiti stained the walls, old initials, carved dates, the usual signs of teenagers testing boundaries. But near the back wall, someone had scratched something else. Not letters, not numbers, lines. Deep, erratic lines forming a crude depiction of a shape. Tall, long-limbed, with an elongated head and arms that nearly touched the ground. A chill wriggled across my spine. People carve what they fear or what they see. The air shifted behind me. Not a breeze, not a settling board, something heavier. I turned slowly, pulse quickening. My flashlight illuminated only empty doorway and drifting cold. Then the knock came, not from the cabin, from outside, a single resonant thud against wood. I steadied my breath and stepped outside, scanning the porch. The trees were motionless. The forest held its breath the way it had at the quarry, silent, watching, waiting. Another knock. Closer. On the wall to my right, I swept the light across the boards. Nothing. No movement. No animal. A third knock came, this one directly behind me. I spun so hard the beam jittered through the trees. Again, nothing. Rational explanation, the wind. Wood settling, old structures shifting under cold temperatures. But the knocks weren't random or sporadic. They were deliberate. 3 knocks, each spaced the same distance apart, almost like a summons or a warning. My chest tightened. I reminded myself of something I learned early in my career. Fear fills silence with meaning. The mind projects danger where there is none. So I forced myself to breathe, to slow my racing pulse. That's when I heard it, something far worse than knocking. The sound of footsteps moving between the trees. Heavy, slow, crushing frost under immense weight. I shined my light toward the noise. The beam caught only the edges of trunks, the glint of ice on branches, but the footsteps kept coming, steady, patient, as if the creature, whatever it was, didn't need to hide. As if it wanted me to hear. My throat tightened. My hand hovered near my belt. Knife, not the gun. You don't fire a gun unless you know exactly what you're aiming at. Echoes can cost lives. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything became too still again. Then a shape moved between the pines, not fully visible, just a shadow shifting where no shadow should have been, taller than any man, broad-shouldered, covered in something that absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. I aimed my flashlight at it, but the beam seemed to bend around the figure, slipping off as if it refused to illuminate. My breath froze in my lungs. The shape remained motionless, watching me, evaluating. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even dare fully inhale. Then the shape did something I will never forget. It stepped into the light, not fully, not enough for me to see its face, but enough to reveal the outline of thick fur, powerful limbs, and a height that reached the lower branches of the surrounding pines. Its shoulders rose as it breathed, each inhalation deep and deliberate. The stories whispered by locals, stories about a creature that lived between realms of the forest, something older than the pines, flooded my memory. A guardian, some said. A predator, others insisted. A spirit given shape by the land itself. The Yeti, or what this region called its own version of one. I didn't believe in legends. I still don't know if I believe in them now, but belief didn't matter. Not when the creature stood 10 yards away, breathing in measured, controlled rhythm, its head tilted slightly as if trying to understand me. I didn't grab my radio, didn't speak, didn't run. I simply stood there, letting the cold sink deeper into my bones. The creature shifted its weight. The frost beneath its foot cracked with a sound like splitting ice. It took one step toward me, and suddenly the forest erupted in sound. A crackling noise, not from the creature, but from deeper in the woods, like branches breaking under immense pressure. The creature jerked its head toward the noise, then immediately retreated, slipping back into the trees in 2 long strides. Within seconds, it was gone, completely. The footsteps ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the woods. I stood frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. Then the smell hit again, that cold, metallic, mineral scent, just like the quarry path, just like the stone that pulsed. Whatever had chased off the creature wasn't human, and it wasn't done with me. The knocking returned, slow, deliberate, coming from the second cabin now, but echoing unnaturally, too loud, too heavy. My instincts screamed to leave, to get to open ground, to get away from the cabins entirely. But I didn't move. I needed to understand. I needed to see. I needed to know what else stalked Whispers Bend. The knock came again, and this time something answered it from deeper in the woods. 3 slow, hollow thuds. 2 things communicating, not with words, but with rhythm. I backed away, my breath shaking out in white vapor. The forest seemed to shimmer around me, like the air itself was bending. And then my flashlight died. The darkness swallowed everything but the sound of breathing behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body refused the command, no matter how desperately my mind screamed it. Every instinct I'd built over 2 decades of service told me the same thing. If I faced whatever breathed behind me, I might not walk back out of Whispers Bend. My pulse throbbed in my throat, loud enough that I feared the thing could hear it, smell it, taste it in the cold air between us. The breathing was slow, not animal fast, not panicked, slow and deliberate, each exhale warm enough to brush the back of my neck even through the biting cold. It was close, too close, no more than a yard away. My flashlight lay useless in my hand, its dead weight pressing into my palm like an anchor. I tightened my grip, not because I thought it would protect me, but because letting go felt like surrender. The trees were silent. The cabins stood in shadow. The forest held its breath once more. And so did I. Then the breathing stopped. Not faded. Not retreated. Stopped. A stillness followed that felt wrong, like standing inside a vacuum. I forced myself to inhale shallowly, quietly. My lungs protested, aching against the cold that suddenly felt colder than the air should have been. Slowly, 1 inch at a time, I shifted my foot, preparing to pivot. If something was behind me, I had to know what. I had to see it, face it, understand it, or else my imagination would consume me long before the forest did. But the moment my boots scraped the frost, something brushed my coat sleeve, light as a fingertip. Gentle, deliberate. Every hair on my body rose at once. Not from fear, but from recognition. I had felt that touch before, on the quarry path. Just before the whisper of my name, a tremor rippled through my chest. The forest wasn't giving me a new story. It was continuing the one it had started years earlier, threading its warnings together like vines. Whatever lived beneath the outcropping had followed me, or maybe it had never stopped watching. I jerked away from the invisible touch and spun around, swinging the dead flashlight like a weapon. The beam didn't matter. My eyes strained in the darkness. Shapes swam, shadows merged. For a moment, I thought the night itself was leaning toward me, but there was nothing there. Nothing human, nothing animal, nothing visible. Just the lingering warmth of a presence retreating into the dark, receding like breath drawn back into unseen lungs. The forest exhaled again, this time not from behind me, but all around me. A shift of air, a ripple of sound as needles trembled on branches. It felt like relief, as if whatever stood behind me had stepped away, losing interest. But something else replaced it. A deep, rhythmic rumble thrummed from the direction of the second cabin. Slow, heavy, not knocking now. Something deeper. A resonance that vibrated through the soil beneath my boots and climbed into my bones. The hair on my arms prickled as the sound grew stronger, louder, more insistent. The 2 creatures, the 2 forces, weren't done communicating. I staggered backward, trying to put distance between myself and the second cabin. But the rumble followed. It wasn't a creature moving, it was sound moving, crawling through the ground, through the frost, through me. And then, faint through the shaking, came another sound. Footsteps, not heavy this time, not the giant shape from earlier. These footsteps were light, erratic, barely audible except for the crunch of frost beneath them. They came from the same direction as the second cabin, emerging from a gap between trees. I steadied my breath and squinted into the dark, my eyes adjusting slowly. A figure appeared. Small, human, male. I froze. The missing hiker? Impossible. This was a different region, a different case, and the figure moved too strangely. A stutter in its gait, not from injury else, something unnerving. Its arms hung too loosely, its head tilted too far to one side, as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. I lifted the flashlight again, hoping somehow the dead batteries might flicker back to life. Nothing. The figure took another step forward, then stopped at the edge of the cabin's porch. I could just make out the outline of a face, sunken, pale, almost gray in the moonlight that barely broke through the branches. His chest rose and fell in shallow, stuttering breaths. I opened my mouth to speak. He beat me to it. "They're not done." His voice rasped, barely above a whisper, as if speaking caused him pain. His head twitched, his shoulders jerked in a way no human body should move. "Not done," he repeated, eyes flicking between the trees behind him. Still hungry, still calling. Cold slid down my back like a blade. "Who?" I asked. He blinked. Slowly, his lips trembled as he spoke the next word. "Spirits." The air thickened. Pine needles rustled overhead. Something large shifted deeper in the woods, responding to the word. The figure stepped forward again, his breath visible in the freezing air. When he moved into the faint moonlight, I saw his face clearly for the first time, and I understood why he seemed so wrong. His eyes were milky, not blind, occupied. His pupils barely visible beneath a film that shimmered faintly. His cheeks were sunken, skin stretched tight over bone. A dark residue, ash or dirt, covered the sides of his face and neck. He looked as though the forest had tried to swallow him and then spit him back out. I swallowed hard. "What happened to you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. His body jerked violently, head snapping upward as though pulled by an invisible string. "I went inside," he whispered. "Inside where?" His eyes drifted to the trees. "The cave." The cave. The word felt heavier here, thick with meaning. The place the locals never named directly, the hollow beneath the quarry, the heartbeat in the stone. Before I could speak again, the rumble from the second cabin grew louder. The ground shook. Frost cracked. The figure flinched, stepping back as fear rippled through him. "No," he whispered. "Not now. Not when it's hungry." Something slammed inside the cabin with enough force to rattle the warped boards. A wooden plank snapped, then another. Something was breaking its way out. The figure's voice rose in panic. "You have to go. Now!" I took a step toward him. "Come with me. We'll get help. We'll—" "No!" he cried, his voice suddenly loud enough to echo against the trees. "It won't let me leave. Not again." Again. He'd tried before. Failed. A deep groan tore through the cabin walls, splintering wood, cracking beams, something enormous pressed against the interior, pressing outward, testing its strength. The figure backed into the trees, his jerking movements growing more frantic. "Run," he whispered, "before it chooses you." I didn't need another warning. I turned and sprinted toward the trail, breaking every rule in the Ranger Handbook. Running invites pursuit. Running blinds you. Running makes noise. But reason collapsed under the weight of the thing moving behind me, the thing breaking free. The ground vibrated with its steps, heavy, earth-shaking. The forest erupted in chaos. Branches snapped. Birds scattered in explosive flight. My boots skidded across frost as I tore through the trees, lungs burning, heart hammering. Behind me came a roar. Not animal, not human. A deep, guttural bellow that shook the air like a storm. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I ran until the trees thinned and the first hint of moonlit clearing appeared. My breath scraped raw against my throat. My legs trembled. My hands burned with cold. Only when I reached the main trail did I risk turning. The forest behind me was silent again. Too silent. No footsteps, no knocking, no creature, no pale figure. Just the emptiness of trees that had seen too much. I stood there, breathing unevenly, fighting the wave of terror still crashing through me. The forest seemed to watch, waiting, listening for what I would do next. I didn't return to Whispers Bend again that night, but I knew, with sickening clarity, that whatever lived in those woods had not finished with me. It had only begun. In the days that followed, I carried the weight of Whispers Bend like something lodged under my ribs. Every quiet moment brought back the pale figure's trembling voice. Still hungry. Still calling. The forest smelled different now, sharper somehow, as if the cold carried unseen intentions. And though I tried to move through my duties, as if nothing had shifted inside me, the forest moved differently around me. Trails felt narrower. Shadows stretched earlier. Even the familiar call of the ravens sounded strained, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for what came next. I avoided the quarry road. I avoided the abandoned cabins. I avoided anything that smelled like cold stone or carried the taste of old soil. But the forest avoids nothing, and it does not forget. 2 weeks after Whispers Bend, a winter storm rolled in from the north, coating the forest in a brittle layer of ice. I was assigned to patrol the southern ridgelines, making sure no stranded hikers attempted the climb. The storm was the kind that chokes radio signals and silences even the boldest wildlife, leaving only wind to howl through the trees like something grieving. By late afternoon, the storm thickened, and visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. I turned back toward the ranger station, following the ridge trail as snow peeled sideways across my path like driven sand. The air tasted metallic again, a warning, a memory. And then I heard it. 3 knocks, muted by the storm but unmistakable. I stopped, breath freezing mid-exhale. Snow drifted against my boots. The forest stood still as if waiting for my reaction. I tried to rationalize it, branches hitting one another, a tree settling under snow load, anything natural, but the rhythm was too precise. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. I scanned the tree line, the storm warped visibility, bending shadows and obscuring distance, but the sound didn't come from one direction. It came from below, the ridge, the cave. Fear pried its way into my chest. Whatever I'd encountered in Whispers Bend was only part of the story. The older part, the deeper part, still waited beneath the earth, buried under stone and time and silence. I should have turned back, should have headed down the trail and radioed the station for reinforcement. But something else gnawed at me. Not courage, not duty, guilt. People had been disappearing in these woods long before I ever put on the uniform. Hikers, hunters, campers, men and women who vanished without leaving tracks, without leaving stories. And I had stood above the darkness for years, ignoring the warnings left like scars in the trees, ignoring the locals, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the strange wounds carved into the forest's oldest places. If no one faced the truth, more would disappear. And I couldn't let my silence become another offering to the thing beneath the pines. So I stepped off the ridge trail. Snow crunched under my boots as I descended toward the source of the sound. The storm roared around me, but the knocks continued, rhythmic, patient, expectant. The trees thinned, revealing a rocky overhang coated in ice. The southern entrance to the old cave system the locals insisted had long collapsed. Our maps showed nothing here but fractured stone and dead ends. But the forest knew better. I approached the overhang slowly. Frost clung to the exposed rock like pale veins. The ground vibrated faintly beneath my feet. And as I reached the mouth of the hollow, I saw something that stopped my breath cold. Footprints. Human. Barefoot. Sunken deep into the snow. Trailing directly into the dark. They weren't old. Fresh enough to hold shape. Deep enough to belong to someone who weighed far more than they should. My stomach twisted. The pale man. He had not been a hallucination. I raised my flashlight, which flickered weakly but held, and took a step inside. The cave swallowed the light, drinking it until the beam dulled to a narrow cone. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, echoing into the dark like a slow heartbeat. The smell hit next, cold stone mixed with the same metallic bite I'd followed for years. It coated my tongue, thick, wrong, familiar. I continued deeper. The passage narrowed, then widened again, revealing a chamber carved not by erosion, but by something pushing outward from beneath. Smooth stone lined the walls, worn down in sweeping arcs, as though enormous hands or bodies had scraped along them for centuries. In the center lay a pool, still, black, unmoving, and standing at its edge was the pale figure. He didn't turn when I entered. His shoulders shook with shallow breaths. Frost clung to his hair. His clothes, what remained of them, hung in tatters like shed skin. His feet were bare, blue with cold, bleeding onto the stone, but he stood perfectly still, gazing into the pool as if hypnotized. "Can you hear it?" he whispered. His voice quivered like a fraying thread. I didn't answer. He lifted his head slightly, eyes milky and unfocused. "It's calling again." A ripple spread across the pool's surface, soft, delicate, not caused by water, caused by something beneath it shifting. The figure shuddered. "We shouldn't be here," he said. "It wakes when we come too close." Another ripple, then another, growing. I stepped backward, but the man reached out suddenly, gripping my arm with surprising force. His fingers were ice cold, digging into my coat sleeve. "You must listen," he begged, "or you'll never leave." My heartbeat hammered. "What is it?" I asked. His mouth opened, but another voice answered. A low, cavernous moan rumbled through the chamber, vibrating the stone beneath us. Dust fell from the ceiling. Cracks spider-webbed through the frozen pool as something pressed upward from below. The pale man's grip tightened. "Run." "What about you?" A tear slid down his cheek, clear, freezing instantly against his skin. I already belonged to it. The stone shattered. A bellow tore through the chamber, a roar so deep it shook the marrow in my bones. The pool exploded outward, shards of ice slicing through the air. A massive form surged upward from the water, too fast for my mind to process, too monstrous for my eyes to make sense of. I tore free from the man's grip and sprinted for the entrance. The ground heaved beneath me as the creature slammed against the stone. Water and ice rained down. A limb, or something like one, scraped the ceiling with a screech that echoed through the cavern like metal torn in half. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The tunnel constricted behind me as I ran, the creature's roar swelling to fill every corner of the cave. The walls shook. Stones fell. A blast of hot air breath shot toward me, reeking of ancient soil and something older than decay. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. The tunnel behind me collapsed. I dove into the snow outside just as the cave mouth caved in completely, sealing the beast inside, or at least slowing it. The forest fell silent, utterly, completely silent. Only my ragged breathing broke the stillness. Snow settled around me in delicate flakes. Beneath my hands, the ground pulsed once, one deep, final heartbeat from the thing buried below, then faded. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the swirling storm, feeling the cold seep into my bones. I expected relief. What I felt instead was grief. For the man in the cave, for the things the forest had kept quiet for generations, for the truth I could never tell without being labeled unfit for duty. The storm eased, the trees exhaled, and I finally rose to my feet, shaking. The forest had not taken me, not tonight, but it had marked me. When I returned to the station, I didn't file a report. I didn't mention the footprints or the pale figure or the creature beneath the stone. I simply noted the cave-in along the southern ridge and recommended the area be closed for safety. But sometimes in the depth of winter, I still hear it. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more, rhythmic, patient, calling. And now, after everything I've seen, everything I've run from, everything I've survived, I understand what the locals have whispered all along. The spirits of the pines do not hunt for us. They call for us. Because something older, something hungrier, something buried beneath stone and silence is always listening. And one day when the forest is ready, it will answer.